I'm Jon Laansma. I am the Gerald F. Hawthorne Professor of New Testament Greek and Exegesis and the Wheaton-based director working along with David Capes on this podcast.
Dr. Jon Laansma, it is great to see you again, my friend. Well, I saw you briefly, all too briefly, in Denver for Society of Biblical Literature.
We could have sat down, but hopefully sometime soon.
I hope so. I hope I get back to Wheaton pretty soon. It's been a while since I've been able to be there, but it's great to see you. We're going to talk today about a fundamental question that I know you're asked, and I'm asked sometimes about it. And how does a classical languages degree get you ready to read New Testament Greek and get you ready for exegesis? Now, that's the question that I sent you. You did a great job kind of thinking through the steps of it, but that's kind of the conversation today.
I'm grateful for that question because it is strategic. Naming ourselves is a challenge. If you're looking for a brief, catchy name, you can't say everything. No matter which direction you go, you're going to raise some questions. So, yeah, I broke your question down into 3 or 4 or 5 separate questions, and I'll just
Yeah.
kind of run those, and you can interrupt me when you want. But
Yeah. Well, I mean, so I guess we want to begin is what do you mean by classical languages, right?
yeah, why are we called classical languages? Because for a very long time we were known as ancient languages.
Talking about it at Wheaton College now, right?
College, we were the ancient languages major, which is fine. But there was a moment when the department as a whole was renaming itself from foreign languages, and it settled on modern languages. Well, that meant we had to come up with some special designation for ourselves, and we considered ancient languages, but it seemed a bit too vanilla as a designation. So we considered biblical languages as a option, but that didn't quite embrace Latin, which is one of the three that we concentrate in.
Mm-hmm.
And we also did not want to discourage any students who might be interested a little bit more in classical studies
Right.
than occasionally, or for graduate work beyond us, than biblical studies. So we didn't want to use a name that suggested we weren't doing, because we are, especially at the upper division level, offering classical readings. We also, biblical languages doesn't have to as a name, but can encourage some utilitarian motives for learning the languages that we don't really want to encourage. And I'll kind of circle back to that, but we wanted to avoid that.
So what do you teach? What goes on in a classical languages kind of program? What kind of things do you teach at Wheaton College in classical languages?
Well, okay, so we settled on classical, although strictly that designates the languages of the classical world, so Greek and Latin, but we're stretching it a bit to include the ancient Near East and Hebrew in particular. So
Mm-hmm.
that's what we decided to focus on. And also, I was going to say also because there is no, at bottom, there is no such thing as biblical Hebrew and biblical Greek. This was just the Hebrew language of the Hebrew people,
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay, right.
the world. So you can talk about biblical Greek, and what you mean is the Koine Greek as represented in these particular texts.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a little misleading to refer to it as biblical Greek and biblical Hebrew. So what do we actually teach here? Well, yeah, a few things. One, we teach languages. We're not a biblical studies program, and we're not a classical studies program. We're a languages program. We're part of the languages department.
Mm.
So that's 3 semesters: 101, 102, 201, in all three languages: Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. And in the Greek side of things, we actually begin in Koine Greek. The label of the program is classical languages, but we actually use a grammar keyed to the Koine Greek of the New Testament, the Septuagint, as our beginning grammar.
When you say koine, for those who don't know that word, what does that mean? Just want to be clear about that.
And these are rough dates, but roughly the Greek from about 300 BC to 380, thereabouts, the common Greek used in that era, which is not a different language than classical Greek, but it's undergone enough significant change in syntax and to some extent vocabulary to be considered that it's a distinct phase of the Greek language compared to the earlier classical Greek and the later patristic or Byzantine Greek that followed.
Gotcha.
So again, our introduction is on the level of Greek is oriented to Koine, but then we offer upper division Hebrew reading classes, Latin reading classes, and then also both classical readings classes, so that'll be in Homer, Thucydides, and so forth, as well as upper division rapid Greek reading courses in the New Testament and Church Fathers. So for those students, even though we're beginning with Koine and even though our beginning classes are oriented to the New Testament, especially, we just want to make sure that students whose interest is more in the classical line, we every year offer, usually in the fall, upper division classical Greek classes.
That's great.
That's what we actually teach. Now that circles back to the question of why Koine. Why did we start there as opposed to classical? Because there are arguments for beginning with classical. To some extent, the answer to that was decided a long time ago at Wheaton College and other colleges. There are larger, much larger cultural, societal shifts away from teaching classical Greek, which used to be standard if you're looking back 100, 150 years.
Mm-hmm.
So we're a long way removed from that, and increasingly students don't begin their Greek until this stage of things in college. And especially in a Christian college context, while we still have some students who want to go on to classical studies, probably the majority of students, their primary interest is in the New Testament and maybe in the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint. So it just makes in that context, a more natural starting point. And I like to think of it as a port of entry into a large continent.
That's a great phrase, yeah.
Your port of entry can be New York or it can be San Diego or somewhere else, but the point is once you've disembarked and you're on the continent, you can travel any direction you want. So once you've been introduced via Koine Greek, you can enroll, once you've made through 3 semesters, you can enroll in your upper division classical readings class. And there will be an adjustment. It'll take a week or two to pick up some of the differences in syntax, which are there, but shouldn't be exaggerated, in vocabulary and so forth. And pretty soon you hit your stride and off you go.
Isn't it true that sort of vocabulary has to shift regardless of what you're doing? I mean, if I'm reading in Gospel of Mark and then I move to, let's say, First Clement in the early patristics, I'm going to need an adjustment there. Or if I'm reading in Mark and I want to read Hebrews, I've got to make an adjustment there because vocabulary does sort of change book by book.
Yeah, different individuals. You and I probably have different words that are favorites and that tend to populate our speech and writing.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody who really studied you and me and another writer could work that out just by looking at the text themselves.
Yeah. Those stylistic things really matter, and if I'm talking about small engine repair, I'm going to be using a certain set of vocabulary that I don't use when I'm talking about theology.
Topic, genre, all those things can have an influence on the vocabulary. So those are adjustments you're always going to have to make no matter where you begin. We start with Koine for that reason. And then kind of another part of your question here, breaking it down, is, what can you expect to learn in each of those steps, each of those classes? And so I like to tell students out of the gates in 101, 102, you're going to learn very, very basic and limited vocabulary. And then as far as grammar, with grammar, you're always talking about what's called morphology. Those are word forms or spelling, and word functions or syntax. Those are the kind of the 2 halves. In 101, 102, it's mostly about morphology. It's mostly about learning forms, just learning how to conjugate, parse verbs and nouns and all the rest, so you can put the sentences together.
Yeah.
The very limited basics of syntax and vocabulary. And then 3rd semester, 201, is where you reinforce those gains in spelling, morphology, grow the syntax, try to flesh that out, and start to gain some practice in reading. So it's like a three-legged stool. After 101, you've got a one or table. You've got a one-legged table, which isn't going to stand up very well.
Right.
102, it's got two legs. So you need 201 to fill out that syntax and start to get some reading practice and expand your vocabulary. And now after 201, now you're introduced. You haven't, I would say you haven't learned the language, you've been introduced to the language. That's where the learning starts. And that's where we have the upper division rapid reading classes every semester for Greek and once a year upper division for both Hebrew and Latin. So there's a good rich cycle through texts and topics in all of those passages. And I dare say there are not that many undergraduate programs who offer that kind of menu of upper division. There's many programs that offer 2 semesters or 3,
but not the others as well.
and maybe some exegesis classes, but just in terms of reading through text, just getting that facility with the language. There are others, but that's pretty exceptional.
So you're a part of the Department of Modern and Classical Languages. So do you do a degree in classical languages, or do you do a degree in Greek, or do you do a degree in Hebrew?
Our main major is just classical languages, and as it stands right now, that would mean you would achieve that 201 level in 2 of the 3 languages. So Greek and Latin probably, or Greek and Hebrew, and then an upper division class in our capstone. We have an honors option, which would involve another 12 hours beyond that, which sounds like a lot, but it's actually pretty close to what we used to have as a standard major. So it's very doable. Many students have done that kind of work. And we have several what we call integrated major options, where you can combine 24 hours with us in Greek or Hebrew or Latin, and say another 16 hours in art or philosophy or history or English, and then also use those other 16 hours toward the other major. If you want a double major, you're allowed to double dip in those kinds of ways. But the other part of your question, your leading question, was how does this prepare one for exegesis?
Right.
Supposing one wants to go in the direction of biblical studies, and supposing their interest is careful, close reading of a text. To those students, I kind of want to say, well, yes, I agree with you. In fact, that's kind of my background and my training, and ultimately my interest. I'm an exegete. I'm a New Testament scholar. But kind of like it is said, a grain of wheat has to fall into the ground and die before it's going to bear much fruit. That has to be the case with language learning related to exegesis. Or to change analogies slightly, there's a time for the harvest, and that time is for most things the fall. You try to rush that in the spring when you should be plowing and planting, or the summer where you should be, tending things. You're actually going to destroy what you're after in the fall, which is the harvest. And if you want to be a outstanding exegete, the best way to achieve that goal, I think, is to let go of the exegesis for a prolonged season and just soak yourself in the language. In a sense, forget about the exegesis for a moment and just soak yourself in ancient Hebrew and in classical Koine Greek as a language, as a human language system. And if you do that, you're going to be all the better equipped down the road. And if you'll indulge me, I actually have a quote, F.F. Bruce.
Oh, yeah.
And for those who don't know, most probably do, but for those who don't know, F.F. Bruce in the kind of mid to late 1900s was considered to be the dean of New Testament studies. He himself was classically trained, but he became an outstanding New Testament scholar. And this is actually a couple of passages put together from his writings. So I'll just read them here. He says, "It is not appreciated today as it should be that a man," and we would now say a person, a man or a woman, but he was writing in an earlier age, whose knowledge of Greek is confined to the Greek New Testament, or even to the New Testament together with the Septuagint, does not really know Greek, not well enough at any rate to translate it with any authority. And he says, no student of the New Testament can afford to ignore classical usage. And he goes on, I've met students who claim to know Greek on the basis of their acquaintance with the Greek New Testament. And he says, even if that latter acquaintance were exhaustive, it would no more amount to a knowledge of Greek than acquaintance with the English New Testament would amount to a knowledge of English. To know a language, even an ancient language, involves having such a feeling for its usage that one can tell almost as by instinct whether a construction is permissible or not, or whether a translation is possible or not. Translation is not simply a matter of looking up a word in a dictionary and selecting the equivalent, which one would like to find in a particular passage. He goes on from there. I won't read it, but he
Wow,
goes
yeah. No, that's great. That's great.
William Kelly's commentaries where he just illustrates the truth of that.
Hmm.
No clicking and parsing on a computer program, no consultation with a Greek grammar text or dictionary can get you where you just need to soak yourself in the language
Yeah,
if you want to read it expertly.
that's fantastic. Well, this has been very helpful today, Dr. Jon Laansma, our Wheaton-based director for this podcast. Thanks for being with us today.
Yeah, glad to talk about this too. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, well, we look forward to seeing lots of other students take up the mantle of becoming a classicist.
May their tribe increase.
Amen. What a great conversation. I hope you agree. Now, there's only 168 hours until the next podcast drops, so watch for it. Subscribe to this podcast, rate us today. If you want to study biblical languages, you need to consider Wheaton College. They have the best program in the country, bar none. Go to wheaton.edu, look for modern and classical languages. Get started today. Come on, you know you want to. Thanks for those who make this podcast possible. Jon Laansma is our Wheaton-based director, Ian Rosine, and Rebecca Larson. Thanks to Phil Keke for our music. Until next time, thanks for listening.